And joining us now, great to welcome in, it's really an interesting book about our industry here, the broadcast industry. It's called The Network, The Battle for the Airwaves and the Birth of the Communications Age. We're going to find out all about it. We're joined today by Scott Woolley. He's based out in L.A. today. He joined us by telephone. And Scott, good to talk with you. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Always been interested not only in broadcasting, doing it, but the history of it. I grew up in New York and took the tour of the NBC studios when I was a kid, so I always had kind of an interest in it. And this book really involves some of those pioneers who one of them was based at NBC, right? Or invented NBC, I guess you could say.
Absolutely. I sort of fell into it in a different way. I had been working as a reporter covering telecommunications and all the wireless stuff that's going on today with smartphones and Wi-Fi and all the rest, and then started hearing about the early wireless industry and the early broadcast industry that way, and all these fascinating stories, and came upon these two characters that are kind of at the center of the book. But yeah, I got sucked into the same thing that you were just talking about, those old NBC tours and stuff. There's just a fascinating history when people first started using these invisible waves to connect with each other.
You almost think that radio was always there, or just kind of popped up, but there was a big battle just to figure out how to make money with it, like any industry, I guess, or any technology.
Absolutely, and so this book sort of starts focuses largely on David Sarnoff, who gained fame at NBC and RCA early on. But in the very early days, he's a 15-year-old immigrant from Russia, shows up in Manhattan at 10, and then 5 years later he gets his first job with the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company. And that company was the first real wireless communications company in the world, really. But they spent 20 years trying to make money just sending telegrams through the air. They had some notable successes. The Titanic rescue was engineered by the two Marconi operators on board, one of whom survived. But that was the really early days of wireless communication, when no one had a way to make money with it. There was a wireless app. Basically, you could send text messages through the air. They called them telegrams. But no one really had a way to make money for it until Sarnoff and several others started working on AM radio in the 20s.
Yeah, until they figured out to have content and then put advertising next to it. That's what really opened it up. You would have thought that would have been obvious, but obviously it wasn't then.
Yeah, and you read what the AT&T guys, who were sort of big rivals to Sarnoff, were saying, and they kind of imagined it recreating the telephone and the telegraph, point-to-point communications,
right.
Person-to-person communications. And one of Sarnoff's big innovations was, hey, we can radically cut the cost of connecting people if we just make it this one-way transmission media, this broadcast media. So that was a real innovation in the business model that he came up with in his 20s. And some other people supported as well, certainly, but that really revolutionized the industry by just radically expanding the power of the air to distribute information. And that's this pattern that we still see going on today in the 21st century.
I guess the rivalry or the battle was between David Sarnoff and Edwin Armstrong, who really did most of the actual inventing, right? He was the scientist.
Right, and it starts out as this great partnership and friendship, and what really got me sucked into the story was there's this famous, Armstrong had invented the first radio amplifier, he patented FM radio, several other huge inventions, but he ended up having this huge falling out with Sarnoff, and the book opens kind of in the middle of the story when Armstrong is a multimillionaire hanging out in his penthouse apartment in New York, famous, he's an Ivy League professor, and he goes to the ledge, and he's, considering killing himself. So distraught has he got over the falling out with Sarnoff and the bitterness he feels for the way he believes Sarnoff treated him.
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff went on behind the scenes, like you said, to make it an industry that actually made money. And Sarnoff, I guess, was the business mind behind it, but the inventor kind of sad the way his life ended.
Absolutely, and you can see sort of echoes of it, and you look at the Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak relationship at Apple. You need to have these relationships between the technology guys who are just the genius engineers, and then the businessmen who have a deep technical understanding but are also really good at figuring out how normal people, Steve Jobs was amazing at figuring out how normal people would want to use technology. And so those relationships are great and very important, but they also tend to be volatile and fairly unstable, and certainly the falling out between Sarnoff and Armstrong and the the way their friendship turned into this, at least one-sided, from Armstrong's side, just bitter hatred. It's a sort of heart-wrenching personal story, but it also tells you a lot about how these technology companies tend to grow up.
Yeah, Sarnoff put together what became RCA. People know those three initials, the Radio Corporation of America. I guess people think of it more now as records. Remember the the logo with the dog and the Victrola, right? RCA, Victor, right? Wasn't that the same
absolutely.
company?
RCA was, by the middle of the 20th century, the biggest technology company and technology manufacturer around, and it did not really survive Sarnoff's death in the 70s. It was acquired by GE, and NBC, its most valuable asset at the time, the TV and radio network, were sort of absorbed, but that people forget what a giant of technology RCA was in the 20th century, and so I think there's a lot of lessons in why it didn't survive that are also highly relevant for today.
Sarnoff was known as General Sarnoff. I had always heard that him called that. Now, he wasn't really a general in the Army, though. Because he was a tough guy, right?
No, actually, he was. He served as an aide to Eisenhower before D-Day and got himself named to, after a very short period on active duty, he got himself officially made a brigadier general.
He wasn't, okay, he was named that, all right.
Yeah, it's not like he had a serious military service, and a lot of people sort of didn't earn it. And Edwin Armstrong had become a major in the First World War and was always called Major Armstrong. So Sarnoff found a way to outrank him, which probably was another small reason that Armstrong was kind of annoyed.
Kind of interesting, though, the history of radio in itself. I guess it was two radio networks, which became NBC Red and NBC Blue, right? Then one of those branched off to become, was it ABC? Is that right?
The RCA was kind of created by the government to be a patent pool and bring radio together, but then when it started these two networks, eventually the government wanted to break it up, so they split off one of the RCA networks to make it ABC in the 1940s, and that kind of created these three national networks. But what really surprised me in doing the book and following these two characters' stories was I had this impression that the networks were so powerful, and the three networks dominated media and electronic media in the 20th century. In fact, much more of the power, the vast majority of the power, was controlled by the local stations, their local affiliates, the hundreds of local affiliates around the country. They made the money. ABC, I was shocked to learn, and several of these other networks, but ABC, the network lost money for decades in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and the only way they stayed in business was because they owned 5 local TV stations that made more than the network lost.
Yeah, the O&Os in the major cities, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I was interested when you wrote about that too. I figured once they figured out the advertising model, networks made a lot of money, but they didn't. From that
yeah,
on.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and part of it was what you were just talking about. The government really came and was very worried about monopolies on the national level. Are the networks doing things that violate antitrust laws? They were not so interested on the local level, or at least in how the affiliates were behaving in reference to the antitrust laws. But this stuff just sort of forms a backdrop of these stories between these two characters, because Sarnoff understood that political power, and he understood where the economic power lay in the industry, and his old friend Armstrong never really got it and just sort of operated under this belief that the best technology should triumph, and if it wasn't, well, you'd just make a good engineering case. He was very, very naive, and Sarnoff, on the other hand, understood, kind of where the power lay in the industry and how to fight it in a way that you might actually win.
Yeah, and Sarnoff, like you talk about in the book, was a visionary. He even predicted or talked about what became known as the Internet, right, back in the mid-'60s. So he looked forward, didn't he?
Absolutely, and he always said he was not at all interested in the past, and barely interested in the present, and always focused on the future, and he certainly lived that. And his ability to see where technology was going was one of the really amazing things that grew out of this story, from the wireless telegraph to AM radio, and by and satellites. He was early on satellites as a form of communication in the 50s, and by the 60s, he had seen fiber optic communication cables, what he called laser pipes, which is a much better description, I think. Unfortunately, we use the boring name for them now, these glass fibers that we shoot lasers through and that have made the internet possible. But he saw that technology, he saw microchip technology, and he had this vision of a single global network that would carry all forms of communication. And he described the internet in remarkable detail in 1965, which, of course, in 1965 led everybody to think he was crazy. And by that point, a doddering old man, nearly 80, and nobody thought that this guy really knew what he was talking about. So it took about 30 years before before anybody realized, and that speech had kind of been lost to history. Because if you're too good of a technological prophet, people just think you're a kook.
The name of the book is The Network, The Battle for the Airwaves, and the Birth of the Communication Age. We've been talking with Scott Woolley today. And if you'd like to order the book, we'll have a link up on our DougMilesMedia.com website. You can order it right there. Thanks to Scott Woolley for joining us. Thank you for listening to us here on Book Talk, on Talk Across America. Join us again for another interview coming up real soon.
I'm Stan Brock. 30 years ago, I formed Remote Area Medical to help people overseas. But then we found generations of families in America isolated by poverty from the health care they need. Together, we can take dental, vision, and medical help to 1 million adults and their kids, right here at home in the United States.